we'll jump in because I only have you for 45 minutes, which seems like an insanely short period of time to me. We have a few people coming in. But my name is Paul Brown. I just finishing up at Boston College, so I will walk in May with my PhD in higher education. I've worked in higher education for over 15 years now, mostly in student affairs settings, usually actually a blend of student and academic affairs. So through academic advising, I've been an instructor in higher education programs for a number of years. I've kind of bounced back and forth between the two. But I would say my journey started with the student affairs side of the house. So that's usually what informs a lot of the things that I look at. And as we're talking today, if you want to tweet, there's the hashtag right there. In addition to OLC Innovate, you can use that one as well. What I'm going to be doing today is telling you a little bit about some of my research. And for those of you that were at the lightning talks last night and saw me do my 6 minutes there, this is an expansion of that. So you're actually going to get much more detail than I went into in those 20 slides in 6 minutes that I had. And what I want to start with is this quote who comes from Sherry Turkle. Does anyone heard of Sherry Turkle before? There's one in the room, couple in the room. Sociologist from MIT, just across the river from me there in Boston. And she studies how technology is impacting society and how it's impacting kind of human beings in general. She does some really cool stuff. So if you've never read her stuff, I really encourage you to check it out because she does some really cutting edge, interesting things. And she has this quote. This comes from an interview she had with the Chronicle of Higher Education. She says, "I want to study not only what the computer is doing for us, but what it is doing to us." And I like to start with this quote because it really kind of frames some of the things that I was looking at, which is how is technology shaping our behavior? It's not just necessarily a tool that we pick up and put down and that's it, but it's actually changing the way that we interact and what we expect from each other and our behaviors. And certainly that of college students that might be of traditional age coming up through college today because they've grown up with a lot of this technology in their surround, at least, since they were born. Really grew up right alongside it. So you might have seen this picture from last night. This is, in fact, me. This is to prove my tech cred that I had it from a very early age. But that's what kind of informed why I wanted to marry my love of higher education, my love of working with college students with the technology, which is ultimately what resulted in this. So this isn't going to be a research session, so I'm going to give you a brief bit on the methodology, which if you're interested in that stuff, we can go into that in more depth. But I want to spend more time on the results and talking through that and things of that sort. But that's what we're talking about today. So to set the stage, I looked at college students and social media use. Now, we all know that all sorts of software have social features today. So it's not necessarily social media as in Facebook, even though that's what I was looking at, was Facebook, Instagram, things like that sort. But this can really be extended to any software that involves some kind of social feature to it in the learning environment as well. Looking at the statistics, we know that the rising generation is on the internet, right? You almost have to be on the internet in virtue of being a college student. And the way social media use correlates with anything, age is the biggest determinant. So the older you are, the less likely you are to be on social and digital media, and the younger you are, the higher you are. It cuts across race, it cuts across all sorts of different factors. Age is really the only kind of most significant feature of what determines whether you're on. So there's 3 books that I like to recommend for folks that want to understand what's going on with that kind of 18 to 24-year-old rising generation of college students and this social digital technology. And there's really 3 books that I are kind of the main pieces that if you want to dive in depth and you don't want to read research articles, this is where you should go. Online Social Networking on Campus, the first one there. Ana Martinez Aleman and Katie Link-Wortman, coming from Boston College, so I know them pretty well. Really the only qualitative study of traditional age college students being online in social media settings out there. If you want to take a look at that. It's getting to be a little bit old now, so it's showing its age. Certainly some of the concepts are still durable, but it was really one of the first and the only. Dana Boyd in the middle there, It's Complicated, the Social Lives of Networked Teens. If you have a teenager in your life, you should really read this book because it will just tell you everything that goes on in their life. It's great. Of course, teenagers, not necessarily higher education, but they're the ones that ultimately go into that. It gives you a good sense as to what's coming next. Really, really well done. And then Ray Hunko, who goes engaging students through social media, Ray has been researching this topic for quite a while. He does a lot with classroom engagement in particular, Twitter in the classroom, certain social tools in the classroom, what's that impact. This book came out just last year, expands on some of the stuff that he does and goes into some different areas. So that's probably the most spot on of the three up there and the newest. So when I approached this topic, I wanted to look at aspects of identity online. And this word identity is used in many, many, many different ways. I was a philosophy major in my undergraduate career, so I love thinking about definitions and how do you define a word and what does that mean and can we argue it for hours upon hours. And so when I looked at identity, it's amazing how many different ways we use this. But in essence, it's kind of how you view yourself, a certain aspect of who you are and how you construct that. And a lot of our developmental theories reach towards this idea that you have to have a firm, fixed sense of identity. So they all kind of follow a same pattern of, oh, you're beholden to others, you don't really know who you are, you go through a crisis point or something like that, you come out on the other side and you have a clearer conception and say, this is who I am, or you accept it in a different way. Same thing with social identities. You might go through a period where you're kind of prideful, or if you're, a minority identity, you might kind of go against the system, and then you kind of come to a actualization point and you feel better about yourself. They all kind of follow this pattern where you have this firm, fixed sense of identity. And a lot of postmodernists, of course, don't like to play that way. And so they say, well, maybe identity is a little bit more dispersed than that. Especially if we look in online environments, you can see identity as really kind of not just a firm, fixed sense, but changes in relationship to how you're interacting with others or in what social settings you're in, that identity is a little bit more mutable. And so that's where Baudrillard comes in, saying that it's a terminal of multiple networks. And so Gergen, who's another postmodernist, likes to talk about this stuff and says maybe we need to replace that kind of view. And so this is kind of a good setup for how digital and social environments work, because they very much privilege relationships and processes and things that are relative. And so that's what actually informed. This is the formal research question, if you want that. How do college students conceptualize who they are and how they present themselves when they are engaged in digital and social media? And it went in a lot of different directions that I didn't even anticipate. This methodology itself, it was a qualitative study, so I interviewed a 16-student sample. I sat down with them over 3 rounds of interviews, including an observation, and pulled out themes. And it would be surprising how quickly some of those themes came out, and in the directions that they took me that I was not anticipating. So the method I used was grounded theory. So it basically kind of says you go where your participants tell you to go, and they told me. If you're curious as to what they are on, major network-wise, most on Facebook, secondarily on Instagram, and then followed by Snapchat, top 3. Age group I was looking at was 18 to 24. This is consistent with what people ages 18 to 24 in the United States are on social media. So this was not a surprise to me. Some people are sometimes surprised by Facebook. Students are still on it. They use it differently than probably most of us in this room do, but they're still on it. So they said old people use it for sharing, right? Photos and things like that. Whereas they just kind of use it for the events feature, the chat feature, some of the features, but they're not using it for the feed or using it to share things unless they're batch sharing photos, was the one thing that they kept saying to me. So they use it differently, but they're still on it. So I like to call it the windows of social networks. In terms of who these people were, overwhelmingly women, so that does have the potential to bias. Also overwhelmingly white within this. And I put a little asterisk next to that because the next phase of research and some stuff that people are doing is to really look into different identities. So how do African Americans navigate these types of environments? How do Latino students navigate these environments? There's some really interesting things that even I got glimmers of in my own research. LGBT students in particular was really fascinating. I had a couple in my study, and you could tell that there was a lot to mine there, especially since it's an identity that they could hide online very easily. And so there's a lot of interesting implications to that. Most of them took coursework in digital and social media at some point. That was intentional, that I tried to get a number of them, because what I found was in pilot studies, when I talk with students about this topic, if they hadn't taken coursework, they're often not equipped with the language to be able to talk about it in a fairly sophisticated way. So those that had taken coursework in it, had reflected on it, had some language to use, and we could really delve into it much more deeply. Predominantly in their 4th year of college, because I wanted to take a look back to what they had from their 1st year in college all the way through their 4th. Question? Yes. The former, which also probably included the latter, right? So there were a number of courses, because this was at a couple different institutions, that either from a business or a communications perspective talked about social media, and so used that in the actual being of the course. So it was the content. Yep. And they were just a much better position to talk about it than some of my other ones. I also picked heavy engaged users. So let's see if I got that. I picked heavy engaged users back here. So that was defined as using 3 or more of these networks multiple times a day. Because again, if students weren't engaged on it heavily, it didn't really carry a lot of meaning for them, right? So they didn't live in part of their lives online. So I was really looking for students that live digitized lives, ones that actually said, yeah, being online is an important feature of who I am. And if you rip that out, that's significant to me. Students who didn't engage on social media weren't feeling it that way. So we're definitely looking at a select group, right? This is not the average college student. We're looking at who's at the extremes, so that maybe, hopefully, my hope was, where are we potentially going in the future? Because all the statistics show that that's rising, right? So if we look at people that are at the front end of the bell curve, maybe that'll tell us where we're going. The question was, did we see any, I have to remember to repeat the question for the online folks, any people rejecting kind of an online life? Because of my sample, not obviously this group, but, and we'll get into this a little bit in the results, there are students who, after having gone through a period of being dissatisfied in part with some other online lives, renegotiated where it fit in their lives. So they didn't give it up. They said it was still important. They knew they needed to be online for career, for all these other reasons, but they renegotiated where it fit in their lives, so that it wasn't necessarily such a central feature. Was in part what they did in there. So I want to give you a small example of one of the things that I did. So I spoke with them. I had three iterations. I spoke with them once, kind of to set the stage. And then on the second one, I had them hop on their phones. And I sat there next to them and said, okay, you've got 10 minutes before class. Show me what you do. And so they would go on their phones, and they would narrate what they're doing. Well, first I'd go into Instagram. Okay, tell me what you do on Instagram. I'd look at this photo, and then I'd like this, and why would you like that? And we walk through and kind of did this observation before wrapping it up with a third interview. And so one of the things I did, if you want to do this too, is take out your phone, open any kind of social media app, the one you would use the most, the one you would check the most. If you don't have a phone, you can think about it. If you don't use social media, again, you can think about it. And I had students navigate to their profiles at a certain point in here, and I said, look at your profile, look at the last 3-4 posts that you have on there. If someone else were to look at those posts and say who you are, or describe you based on just what they see in those posts, what would they think about what they would say about you? Who is this person that they're viewing? right? So I don't know any of you in this room. I'm looking at your profile and I'm saying, oh, Johnny is X, Y, and Z. If you had to describe yourself as how other people would view you. Now, what's different from your experience in doing this and looking at it is when I was doing this with students, I was over their shoulder, right? So they had someone watching them, this third party. And so that made them hyper conscious about what those things that they were seeing were. In fact, many of them, there were a few that would kind of like do apologize for their behavior. Gosh, I take a lot of selfies. I didn't realize I took a lot of and feel kind of embarrassed about it because there was this other person watching that in the moment they didn't think about, right? But then having someone gaze on their profiles right there when they're there changed the nature of it. So when you see what you saw right now and you're looking at it and you're trying to think of how would a third party person, you probably weren't thinking about that in the moment when you maybe posted something. That's true of, I think, most everyone. And for a lot of students, in fact, an unintended outcome of even just doing this research was that they were very rarely reflective on what they posted. They never stepped back and thought of like, how do I use social media? How does it fit into my life? Which I think for educators is interesting because sometimes they just might jump into using the tool without stepping back and being like, hey, what's my workflow? How do I organize myself? How am I using these things? What are all the features? What am I not using? They don't step back and do that. And that was very consistent with that. They also thought it was this odd to kind of hold up a mirror to themselves was one way this participant described it because they had never had that happen. No one's having that conversation with them, that kind of meta conversation. And so to jump into a little bit of the results, there are kind of two things that came out. In the literature that's out there, folks that look at this with college students, this term digital identity is used a lot. It's used a lot of different ways. If you look at it up on Wikipedia, which I consider the common usage, it usually means the data of what's out there on you. Your digital identity means all that stuff that Amazon sucked up about you and knows about your preferences is your digital identity. But digital identity, as it's often used here, is sometimes called an online identity. It's how you're viewed as a person or how you're seen. Your representation, your profile of how other people see you, your reputation, your digital reputation, versus what's digital development. Because when we talk about development, we talk about identity, and so sometimes it's easy to conflate these two. So I want to tease that out for you just a little bit, because both were present in here. So digital identity, as I'm using it, as we talked about it with students, is often sometimes referred to as a digital stamp. Your footprint online, all the things that you put out into the digital domain that people can find you. When I Google you, I am looking at your digital stamp in part. It's what people find. And that I worked with this gentleman, Eric Qualman, on an update to one of his books, and it's called "What Happens on Campus Stays on YouTube." And it's intended for college students. It's written for college students. It could be probably almost anyone, because I think some of us are still working through some of this. But we narrowed this down with some of the issues they find in particular. That talks about what's your reputation, what's your digital reputation when you're finding jobs, when you're the first thing people are going to do is they're going to Google you and they're going to look for you. So how are you behaving online? Do you even know what's out there? And we walk through what Eric calls the new rules for your reputation on campus, online, and beyond. And that's really the digital identity, the reputation piece, which is an important site for education, actually, because that's what we need to educate students about, and I don't think that they're getting. They very much I speak on this on a fairly regular basis, and college students, by the time they hit college, if they're 18, 19, they've heard in high school, don't post this online. Be afraid of online. Don't get online. Make all your accounts private. Scary, scary. Bad, bad, bad. Those are generally the messages they've been getting through high school. Don't do it. Don't do it. And so by the time they hit me with college and I'm talking with them, they're like, yeah, but I want to know what I can do with it. Like, stop telling me what I shouldn't do with it. I want to know what I can do with it. And that seems to be the message that's not as present in what we're teaching them is, okay, great. Be scared and afraid of these things. Here's the ramifications of it, but here's what you can do with it. That's what they're thirsty for. My research participants all mentioned it. That's my anecdotal evidence whenever I speak at colleges. That's what they want to hear. Tell me how I can use that to create things. Tell me how I can use that to find people to connect to. Help me make that into a career. They're not understanding these digital tools for their possibilities. And so that's usually what I'm talking about when I'm talking about their digital identity, how they're viewed online. Let me pause there. Are there questions before I jump and switch it over to the development piece? Yeah. Here, if you're going to comment, let me give you the mic so that the online folks can.
I really like where you're going with your research. Interestingly enough, the gentleman asked a question, and I'm really glad you brought that out about Facebook. When I was at Abilene Christian, before I transitioned to another university, we did research on Facebook with freshmen at our university, and we found out 64% of them took a voluntary fast because they were trying to figure out, how do I deal with this? So it's really neat to see that coming out in your research as well. Appreciate you bringing that up.
That's highly consistent. In fact, we'll find this a little bit later. The idea of taking a break from social media, almost all my students said they did that at one point. And it was actually a very, I perceived, healthy kind of developmental behavior, because social media can kind of have this all-encompassing, you get sucked into it and you don't even realize what you're doing after a while kind of aspect. And so when they would take breaks, it would almost reset their relationship. So that break would allow them to step back and say, okay, wait a minute, how do I want this to fit in my life? I have a choice here, rather than just getting sucked into it and doing it. And so whenever they would take these breaks, and they almost all said that, that's what that allowed them to do. It was pretty consistent. In fact, I hadn't even thought about asking that. But one of my dissertation committee's members said, you should ask if they've ever taken a break about. So it was one of the best questions I ever asked them in there. So we're going to switch, and this is what we're going to talk about for the remainder part, a psychological process. What's going on when they're in part living their lives online. It's a different context. It's a virtual context, right? So it has different sets of rules. So there's my favorite digital developmental theory, which is the modified version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Battery life followed by Wi-Fi, followed by food, water, and shelter. But I'm going to use this one instead, which I don't know if you're familiar with Marsha Baxter Magolda's work. She talks about self-authorship. She also works very closely with Robert Keegan, who's from Harvard. Their theories are actually quite similar. You don't need to know the details of the theory to understand kind of where we're going with this. But her basic trajectory is that, and this is true of most developmental theories, you move from a period of external to internal definition. So high school years, you can see external very readily. Am I cool? What do my peers think? You're all externally defined, right? You want to appear as they're part of a group. You haven't really become comfortable and say, this is who I am, and whether you like that or not, I care, but I don't really care. I am who I am, and I'm comfortable in my own skin. That's not what that's not where you are with external definition, right? Let other people define you to a point where you kind of have a solid sense of who you are. That's the general trajectory that most developmental theories follow. And in looking at my students, that's exactly what emerged. The same kind of behavior. So if you apply that to digital context, I realize this text is somewhat small, so I will violate good presentation rules and read you text from my slide. On the earlier end, external, so you're talking about folks who are certainly young teenagers. I mean, this can continue into a senior year of college if they're traditional age and they're going straight through. It's related to age, but it's not necessarily age-based. Students in this period, they're experimenting with digital and social media. They're trying to figure out, like, how does this work? They're strongly influenced by authorities, so parents saying you can or can't be on this site, you can or can't have a phone, you can or cannot do this. Teachers telling them, be afraid, don't get online, put your privacy settings up. Colleges are going to search for you when you apply for admission. They're influenced heavily by authorities as well as peers and peer culture. There was an excellent This American Life podcast called Status Update that came out in November, where Ira Glass talks with a bunch of teenagers who are just starting their freshman year in high school. And if you want to feel for what peer culture looks like, listen to that podcast. It's great. Dana Boyd's also goes into that quite a bit. Students at this stage generally, they don't understand how online and offline interactions can impact each other. A good example of this is I mentioned I worked in student affairs. I worked in residence life. And so at the very beginning of the internet, and this is still true today, very beginning of Facebook anyways, students were shocked that we could found a picture of them drinking alcohol in their residence hall room on their Facebook profile, that they could get in trouble with the college or university for violating a rule. Like, they're like, but that's on Facebook, that's private. That they would think that somehow in that space, then the rules didn't apply. And so definitely with folks at this stage, they don't really understand how online and offline worlds are actually related. Like, oh, I post something, it could have ramifications in the offline world. That's just, they're not very sophisticated about that. As they move towards internal definition, so towards the right here, vets and students are generally making conscious choices about how they want social media to fit in their lives. So this goes back to the taking the break idea of, how do I want it to fit in? And if I step back, do I want to be online a lot, or do I not want to be online very much at all? Like, they may make that choice, but this is where they're starting to do that. They also start to understand context and how they have to renegotiate everything over time. So how you use these digital and social tools is going to change with where you are in your life and what they mean to you. I had one student in my sample that had graduated, was in her first year post-undergraduate. And her experiences were really interesting for comparing against the undergraduate peers, because she said, yeah, now all my friends are dispersed across the country, so I use social media to stay connected to them. I also feel pressure to post photos to show that I'm being successful as an adult after college, right? Like, look, I made lunch today all by myself, kind of a thing. Hashtag adulting, those kinds of things. And so it changes with your life. If you're 37 like me, then your social feeds are filled with people running marathons because they're suddenly confronted with the fact that their body is aging, right? And they need to get healthy. I've previously been through the here's all the children phase. I've been through the weddings phase, and all the different ways in which social media changes with how we go through our lives and what stage we're at. So if you want to think of it this way, this is way oversimplified, but it may help click some things. Digital identity and reputation is kind of what we produce. It's what we put out into the digital sphere, versus digitized development, which is the quotes from the students that I'll be giving you in a minute. Talks about who we think we are. Digital identity and reputation is what other people see. The digitized development is more how we see ourselves. The identity and reputation can be taught through rules. So like the book I mentioned with Eric Coleman, we can say, do this, don't do this. I can teach you what to post or not to post online, as far as being worried about an employer seeing it. But to really understand those rules, that's where the development comes in. Like, when do I apply this rule? When is that okay? Digital identity and reputation is usually a byproduct development, and then the digitized development is the developmental process itself. So it's kind of this reciprocal relationship. Where you are developmentally determines what you put out into the online sphere, how that's perceived by others, your interactions through that. You'll learn some things from that, and your developmental level will change, right? So your digitized developmental level will change, and then you'll modify your identity, and it kind of goes in this cyclical type pattern. So, oops, I make a mistake online, I learn from that, I regrow, I rechange the way I approach my identity, and then it keeps going. So that's generally kind of how that process works in terms of the way they portray themselves. But this is the fun stuff, the identity-based stuff. This is one of the things that I was not anticipating, but came out loud and clear from every student that I talked to, which is that the like is perhaps the most important social currency in this world. I didn't know if you were aware of that, but it is. Likes matter. And if you think about likes, and I don't just think about it like the Facebook like, or the Twitter favorite or things like that. You can really generalize this to any kind of online engagement. So if people put comments on your piece of content that says something about you, if people are responding to a post that you put in a community forum that says something about you. It's any kind of validation tool. You can think about it as badges. None of my students talked about it that way, but I think likes in part are like badges or some of the gamification elements that we use in different digital environments. Anything that gives you that kind of like validated feel. And so my students, of course, are talking about it as it relates to social media. And Addie, who's one of my participants, had something interesting to say about it. She says, how many likes did your post get? What does that mean? That number in itself doesn't mean anything unless you compare it to other posts. Then you get this whole thing where people start comparing themselves to other people. That really isn't the best route to go down. Is that what you should be doing whenever you have a piece of content and it doesn't do as well as someone else's? What does that say about you? I personally don't think that you should take something like that personally. Wow, everyone on the internet hates me. I don't think that this should be the reaction, but I don't know that everyone else feels the same way. I know people that have deleted posts because they don't get enough likes. I know people who unlike a photo on Instagram because it suddenly now has 100 likes and they're mad about it because theirs doesn't. That doesn't make much sense to me. You're thinking about it too much. Addie talked about this comparison thing. This is very much an externally defined behavior, right? Johnny has more likes than I do. That means he's more popular than I am or is leading a better life than I am. So this engagement and seeing these engagements matters only in context to how many do other people have, right? And so this comparison thing was something that almost all of my students mentioned that they struggled with at one point or another, was that they felt the need to compare themselves to others. And so they also then felt the need to create these perfect images of who they are. So this comes from an artist on the internet who, what he did, you'll see a few more of these. Here's what you see on Instagram in this square, and then here's actually the mess that's going on around it. Because if you've ever been on Instagram, there's a certain Instagram type photo where everything looks perfectly placed and artsy. And this artist was trying to say, here's what's actually going on around it. Another representation of that, right? The Facebook version of you, which is awesome and rocking out, and the realistic version of you, which has Cheetos on your stomach. But my students would repeatedly say that, I have to post good content. Mizzou, in the back of my mind, there's a certain standard of interaction that I get on every single tweet, and I don't want to make it drop below that, that matters. And so many students didn't really recognize that when you're online, you're only really seeing a selective view of reality, right? You're only seeing a certain slice. You're only seeing what an algorithm perhaps even chooses to show you. You're not usually seeing the whole of everything. And so Hallie says, I think it was cool that my professor asked us to think about the highlight reel. Do we use social media as a highlight reel of our lives? And how many times out of 10 would you say that you wouldn't post something because it's not a highlight? And all of us were like, oh, all the time. He was like, go through your day. How many things would you post and how many wouldn't you? And so Hallie said she would encourage educators to ask their students about recognizing, not necessarily changing it, but recognizing that what they post and what other people post isn't 100% of their lives. Because there's a lot of times when you think that people have the best life ever because of what they're posting, when in reality they're going through a lot and probably many similar things that you are, but because they're posting all this fun stuff, you think their lives are perfect. And this, again, was another common theme. Now, remember, these are students towards the end of their college careers, so they're probably 21, 22 years in age. So they're in a different place. But they've gone through this experience before, and many are still kind of struggling a little bit with this. And so for them, one of the struggles that they went through was this idea of context collapse. Dana Boyd talks about this a lot. It's when physical and virtual environments kind of collide. What happens when they overlap? A classic example of this is my father, who's 80, feels the need to comment on every single one of my posts all the time. And then when my friends comment on it, because maybe it's more of an inside joke, he then feels that that is an opportunity for him to engage them in conversation. And for me, it's like the teen in that situation. I'm like, Dad, that's really embarrassing. Please stop, right? And I'm 37. But what these college students are struggling with is when their contexts collapse. So when my father, who's knows me from one context, collapses with my friends who know me in a very different one, you're speaking in one voice, at least through the way the social network is defined, but it's hitting multiple audiences. It's hitting employers, it's hitting all these different groups, and so a lot of my participants talked about how they tried to navigate some of this, and they used some interesting words like, I feel like I'm wearing different outfits or putting on masks when I'm online, or it's this dance that I'm going through. Liam said, it's almost like a dance, you can't be too much of something. Right? So if I post this picture, I don't want to appear vain, but I also want to appear like I'm having an exciting life. So I don't know, like, what's the middle ground between trying to appear like I'm having an exciting life, but not like I'm posting everything about it. Or you're playing games, is another way students described it. All these things that are going on. I've got to keep up. Got to keep posting the positive. Got to keep portraying that everything's great. Portraying that I'm having a wonderful time, that nothing's wrong. And so I had one student, Logan, who is interesting, is he struggled with this a lot. He called it exhausting. It's what causes his unhappiness. Comparisons get so intense, I feel like I'm a constant failure. So just seeing this and taking it in the online environment, he would always be comparing himself against others. He was also interesting because his most used social network, he was the only participant for whom this was the case, was LinkedIn, right? Because LinkedIn's about careers. And so career mattered very much to Logan. And so that's the metric by which he would compare himself to others and feel unhappy. Like, gosh, so-and-so just got this great internship, and I didn't get this internship. What am I doing? I'm not advancing. That's where he would fall. And that's in part kind of this strange phenomenon of consuming these perfected images, right? So you're putting them out there, but now you're only seeing everyone's best positive moments. And there's Logan again, as what I assume is causing my greatest dissatisfaction at college, is seeing my life in comparison to others. And how do I work through that? Even for my participants that weren't Logan, think about it more than I should. It's still there. I think I would say even in my own experience, sometimes I have a little bit of that. Depends on what your day is and where your mindset is. You look at everyone else's life and go, wow, they're having a great time, and I'm, sitting at home binging on Netflix or something like that, and it just seems like someone's having a more exciting life than you at that moment. So I don't know that it's necessarily just 18 to 24-year-olds, but something we all feel. They just feel it more acutely because they haven't learned to navigate that in the same way. And so I used this phrasing before last night, which is teaching students to own rather than be owned by their technology. That's really what kind of came up over and over again for my students was, how can I make it work for me? How can I fit in life the way I want? And not just be subject to wherever it seems to be taking me or wherever I seem to get caught up in how I do it. So we're approaching the end of time. We got about 5 minutes. So I want to pause here for questions or other things that I could help you. Yeah. Here, let me give you the mic so that way I don't have to repeat the question for the virtual people.
Looking at both sides of the social media, comparison, keeping connected and seeing what's going on in the world, do you think that's directly related to some of the, anxiety that college is experiencing? I can tell you our mental health issues at our campus have gone through the roof. We have on-staff psychologists and things like that, and the lines are out the door. I just didn't know what your opinion was on that.
It's certainly contributing in some ways because one of the features of social media, digital media, the fact that it's always on, and I think it's more related to the phone probably than the networks themselves. The fact that you always have it with you, so you're always being bombarded with those images so readily, is a very different life experience than the one I had, where I had the same things happen. It was in the physical world, so it was slower. So when you're in the digital world and you speed that up, I think it has that kind of effect. So it's not really, I never say that it's a different phenomenon. It's not something new. We still probably know, in fact, how to help people through that. But when you put it in a virtual or digital environment where the rules are different, or the word that affordances, which is what it would be called, the affordances of the digital media is different, it instantiates differently. It looks differently. The results of it are differently. So I think that definitely plays into this type of hyperized kind of piece of depression, things like that, competition. You know, high school for me was hard enough. I'm glad I didn't have social networks on top of that, that played into that. But then again, I couldn't do a lot of the cool stuff that, you know, students today can do with their phone and all the digital and social media things that they could do that I couldn't do. So, you know, it's that mixed bag of you get some and you trade off some stuff too. Yeah.
You know, using it as a professional, you usually have different personas. Did you see that in any of the students where from the Snapchat to the Instagram to Facebook, they were actually portraying totally different digital personas?
Yeah. There was one in particular that took it to an extreme. I mean, he's an extreme case. He wanted to go into social media as like a career. And so he had about 10 Instagram accounts with completely faked out identities. Oh, she is a record executive in LA who does this, this, and this, because he was experimenting with it. And I said, how do you keep all those like people in your head? And he's like, yeah, it's kind of hard sometimes. But, you know, we just kind of figure it out. And he was basically managing these multiple, like, kind of catfish type identities across multiple networks. He was by far the extreme. A more common example, and this is interesting, and when I mentioned earlier about, you know, one of the limitations of my research was the actual, like, social identities of the people, the fact they were predominantly white and women. But there's just so little out there. I was like, okay, well, let's just go with it, see what we get. And then that's an avenue for future research. Was I had an LGBT student who was out on one social network, but not out on the other. So mom and dad were on Facebook, so he was not out on Facebook, but on Instagram, which only his close friends were on, and his sister, he was. So he would not post pictures with his boyfriend on Facebook, but he would on Instagram. And so he maintained these kind of almost like two half lives on you know, these different spaces where he was just a different person. And I asked them a lot of questions as to, you know, if I saw all of your different accounts, would you say that I know you? Was one of the questions I asked. And they said, most of them said, no, there are different parts of me. They gave me different analogies. One said the different networks they're on are kind of like different outfits that you're switching on for different audiences. One said it was arms of an octopus. So it's still part of them, like their core, but you're only maybe seeing a part extension of them in different spaces. One called it the Horcruxes from Harry Potter, which is kind of really interesting from an audience perspective, because they said some people might have 3 of the Horcruxes and other people might only have 2, like only see 2 different parts of my personality. Sometimes they may overlap, sometimes they might be different, but they felt like their identity was dispersed. That goes into more of some of the other research, which is the more exotic stuff, which is a little bit harder to apply in a practical setting, which is usually why I don't present on it as much, was when they're talking about dispersion of identity and things like that. But yeah, no, they would manage those multiple things. What time for one more? So, okay. Isn't that very similar to real life, though? Yeah. Yeah. One of the question was, is it similar to how we just live our lives offline, right? And the answer is in part yes, because one of the analogies the students gave was if you're at a party and you're meeting with different people, you can sometimes mold to fit with whatever audience you're in. One student gave an example of a chameleon. They said, yeah, you know, depending on which network I'm on or which setting I'm in, I'm going to change color to kind of like mold to the space that I'm at. I think what's really interesting about the digital space, and this is what kind of goes back a little bit to the previous question of the mental health and things like that, is when I'm a physical person and I'm switching contexts, it's not happening as fast as me switching between social networks on my phone. So I'm like going back and forth. I manage a social media account for my company, so I've on occasion sent, the rogue tweet from the company account that was intended for mine. And so if you're trying to create all these personas and keep them in your head at the same time and switch between them very rapidly while you're walking between things, that's at least a very different experience. So it is the same, but I almost would say it's on steroids. And it's that steroids aspect, the affordance aspect, the how the technology is designed aspect that makes it so interesting and unique. But when it comes down to it, it's still very similar, which is what I leave educators with. And maybe that's a good point to start on is for a lot of these situations, we already know the types of tools, interventions, things that we should do. We just have to modify them a little bit to fit the circumstances of this. I have a roommate conflict between two folks at college. It turns into a cyberbullying type behavior. Well, I already know how to mediate a roommate conflict when it was just in the physical world. I still have those same skills. They still work. I just have to twist it a little bit to account for the digital context where it might be a little bit different. So that's where we'll end it. So thank you for coming today. I appreciate it in the morning. Enjoy the rest of your conference.